Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. And Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so excited to be here with all of you to celebrate Neruda on the Park, a brand new debut novel from Cleyvis Natera, whose fiction, essays, and criticism have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, USA Fiction, Alien Nation, 36 True Tales of Immigration, the Brooklyn Rail, Time, the Rumpus, the Washington Post, the Kenyon Review, Asterix, and Quayle Journal, among other publications. This is a beautifully layered portrait of family, friendship, and ambition. It weaves a rich and vivid tapestry of community, as well as of the sacrifices we make to protect what we love most. It announces her as an electrifying new voice. So we are very, very, very honored to have you here and to get to help celebrate your debut. And there's no one better to help celebrate a debut than Atlanta's own Tayari Jones, who is the author of 4 novels, most recently An American Marriage, which was published in 2018. An American Marriage is an Oprah Book Club selection and also appeared on Barack Obama's summer reading list, as well as his year-end roundup. The novel was awarded the Women's Prize for Fiction, formerly known as the Orange Prize, Aspen's Word Prize, and an NAACP Image Award. It has been published in 24 countries. Jones, a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow, has also been a recipient of the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, United States Artist Fellowship, NEA Fellowship, and Radcliffe Institute Bunting Fellowship. Her third novel, Silver Sparrow, was added to the NEA Big Read Library Classics in 2016. She is a graduate of Spelman College, University of Iowa, and Arizona State University. She's an Andrew D. W. White Professor at Large at Cornell University and the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Creative Writing at Emory University. And we are so excited that one of her previous books, The Untelling, is coming out in a brand new package from Grand Central Publishing on August 15th. So go ahead and pre-order that now so you can get your beautiful copy. I'm going to bring her a copy of Neruda on the Park, but without further ado, let's get right into it, y'all. Please welcome our guests.
We want to start off by making a small correction. The Charis may be the oldest feminist bookstore in the South, but it's also the most awesome feminist bookstore ever in the world. I can't tell you how many writers have said, and I can say it myself, that when I was starting off, I got a reading. I was offered a reading at Charis before I was offered a reading anywhere else. Charis Bookstore is the kind of place where they don't choose who they invite based on the hype. It's a place of substance. So I just want to thank Charis for having us and to thank you for decades and decades of superb work. Well, we are here to discuss Neruda on the Park. And we have the author right here, all the way she came from San Francisco, but she's a New Yorker, and she has not spent time in Atlanta before. So let's welcome her. We did a grand tour this morning. I took her to Spelman. She can see how we do. But now we are here to talk about your book. So when your introduction was being read, all the publications, all the things you've done, I think everyone loves to hear the story of how a debut novelist came to write her book.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for being part of this. And I have so much love and admiration for your body of work and all you do for so many of us coming up to Yari. So thank you for being with me. Wow. And thank you to Charis Books for having me. My story in terms of how this book came to be is a little bit of a winding road. From first sentence to publication, this is 15 years in the making. So this is a book that, I feel like I grew up with this book. I wrote this book at the heels of a failed book. I wrote another book when I was in my MFA program, and that book, we weren't able to sell it, even though I had an agent and we had an editor that was interested. When I decided to put that book away and focus on this story, it came from a place where I really wanted to explore a lot of what I was seeing happening in my neighborhood. I grew up in Harlem. Most of my family lives in Washington Heights. And so when I came back from college, I firsthand saw like what gentrification did to a community. I also wanted to explore telling an immigrant story where my main characters weren't yearning to go back to their birthplace. I felt like that was something that I hadn't seen in the many books that I loved, written by writers I loved. And so I was also really interested in telling a story about a woman who, for the first time in her life, is forced to confront unresolved rage and what happens when, you know, that trauma breaks open and what's left is this unstoppable rage. And it takes the shape of her trying to save her neighborhood. So I was really interested in telling this story, and you know, I wanted to do it in a way that felt sexy and propulsive and funny at times. So telling the story from these two perspectives of a mother and a daughter, and then there are these interruptions by these older women called the tongues, for me was really important.
This story is sexy and propulsive. I mean, I don't know if you all have had a chance to read it, but okay, we have a lot of things going on here. We have a young corporate lawyer, right, who loses her job at the beginning of the story. And she is the one in her family who made it. I heard Ocean Vuong speaking, was it last week? And he was saying that his story was that, you know, his mother sacrificed so much for him to have education, for him to have opportunity. It was as though she was buying him a ticket. I'm not going to say it as well as he did because he's a poet, but his mother, they like almost like he felt like they were buying him passage on a boat. And finally he gets on the boat and he says, he turns to look at the family and say, I'm on the boat, I'm on the deck. And he realizes the boat had set sail and there in the distance. And I kind of felt like this story was different in that she's a big time lawyer, she's making all this money, but she still lives at home. Well, her colleagues all have their awesome apartments in the city. She comes home from her big time job and goes home every day. Can you talk to me a little bit about this idea of both leaving home and staying at home at once?
Yeah, so my own experience, I mean, I was born in the Dominican Republic. And when we immigrated to the US, my mom had been here for 3 years already. And so, you know, there was a separation that happened when my mom first traveled to the United States because we were left behind with my father. And then when she was able to bring, I'm one of four, she brought us, but my father had made a decision that he didn't want to come. And him and my mother were already split up. So when we came 3 years later, we were separated from my father. And then it took all of us by surprise to find out that like my mother couldn't live with us. We were all split up among aunts and grandparents until my mom could afford an apartment. So, you know, we thought we were coming to live with my mother, but my mother was working 24 hours a day. So even when she was able to get an apartment for us, we still weren't living with her. And so for me, like this sense of this questioning of place, of belonging, of home started pretty early, I would say. Like when I was 7 years old was when I first really started reckoning with loss and the idea of like, what is a home and missing people. So, you know, when I went away to college and I came back, each time I would come back home, I would find my neighborhood really radically transformed. So this is like the early 90s. And in New York City, I mean, it was unstoppable, this force of gentrification. And the landlords were being really underhanded. In my own family, like they wouldn't cash the checks and then take people to court. So there was just a lot of underhanded maneuvers being done to empty out the buildings. But then also, I mean, tenement buildings, you know, buildings that had been abandoned were just knocked down to make room for these really luxury buildings. And it was very clear very quickly. And one of the things that happened that I was considering as I was seeing this happening, because at the time, you know, I was ascending and everybody was very proud of me because I was the first one to go to college and I was going to an elite school. But while everybody was very proud of me, at the same time, I could sense this hostility that, you know, I was changing pretty radically. My value system was changing. The way I spoke was changing. And people were like very suspicious of me, even though they were proud, they were very suspicious of like what I was giving up, how I was transforming. So I started working this corporate job, and I was very good at it. I was very successful at my corporate job. And I just remember, you know, I worked in an insurance company. So it was a place where, like, a very conservative place where you had to, like, dress a certain way. They spoke a language that was like a very strange kind of English that anyone that works in corporate America knows. And so it was really interesting to me that I felt like in the workplace, I was also being asked to strip myself and to erase certain parts of who I am to be successful. And the more I was willing to do that, the more rewarded I was. So those were some of the questions I was asking myself and confronting as I was writing this book. And I really wanted to give my main character, Luz, some of those same questions. I wanted her to be someone who really doesn't belong in any of the worlds that she inhabits. And so at home, she is, you know, driven by this obligation that I think many of us, whether you're an immigrant or not, I think if you're coming from working class parents, a lot of times we have this obligation to take care of our parents and to solve their problems. And so it isn't very often that you have this kind of carefree life. I mean, a lot of times for many of us, what it means is that you're going to work, you're going to pay back the sacrifices your parents have made, so that, you know, they can live a better life because they've gone through so much to make it better for you. So I wanted her to have that sense of obligation, but at the same time, you know, the crux of Luz being an attorney is that she's really bought into this idea that success is material success means happiness. So at the beginning of the book, I really wanted her to wrestle with this idea of like, but is it true? Because she feels pretty empty, even though she's giving away all her time and not resting. She's still feeling really like a restlessness and an emptiness around that sense of accomplishment. So I really wanted to have the book ask these really important questions to me about like, what does it mean to belong and not belong in different spaces? What are the things that we are being asked constantly to give up in order to belong and to be part of a group? You know, and then for her quest to find fulfillment and to, you know, like her journey toward finding liberation, which is ultimately what I'm most interested in, is one that is rooted really in like not belonging and then like becoming part of a community.
There's a great scene in the book when she's going to dinner, I think, to breakfast with one of her colleagues, right? This is a very exclusive environment she's in. And when she's there, she realizes that the woman that's cleaning the place is someone she grew up with.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that just to be confronted with this reality of where she comes from and where she's going. And like you said, the woman who she knew from childhood is very kind of contemptuous of her. Like, here you are having this meal, acting like you belong here. You know, you're really from where I'm from, but also feeling out of place with her colleague. When I read that, just the way that this is someone who is between two worlds, I just felt it was a very short scene, probably about 3 or 4 pages, but I felt like you really dramatized and captured that experience of hers. But, you know, it seems like it doesn't seem, at least to me in reading it, that corporate America seems to be working for anyone. It seems like it doesn't work for different people for different reasons.
Yeah.
But like, there's no one who's like, yeah, this is my jam. Well, there is also, just to set up for people who have had a chance to read the book, the neighborhood where Luz still lives with her parents is the place next door. It's been knocked down, right?
Yes.
And they're going to rebuild it is it condos?
Yeah.
Something awesome. Some fabulousness is going up. And of course, we all know that when something fabulous is next door to your home, then your home you'll no longer be able to afford it. Mm-hmm. And the question is, you know, do you want to be bought out? Mm-hmm. Do you want to go home? The father wants to return home, and the mother does not.
Yes.
I have a question for you. In your heart, where is home?
You know, I mean, I feel like I have all my characters asking the questions that I ask myself about home, because when I first arrived in this country, I would say that home was people. Like, I very much felt like home was my father, who I was separated from. And then my father, you know, first he lost his memory because of Alzheimer's, and then he lost his life when I was only 18 years old. And that emptiness, like the loss became so different to me, even though I hadn't seen him in many years. Losing him became like a very different kind of loss. And I remember going back to the Dominican Republic. I mean, we couldn't afford to go back when he first died. So I went back to the Dominican Republic when I was 22. And I remember when we were about to land, like getting this overwhelming sense of like homecoming and like this feeling of joy. But then very quickly when I was there, like everybody in the Dominican Republic was like, oh, like you're a New Yorker. Like my Spanish wasn't the same as before I had gone to the US. And so, you know, it was like being interrogated about belonging, which, you know, as an immigrant in the United States, it doesn't matter how long you've been here. I mean, you hear my voice and, you know, I have an accent, and there is no interaction I've ever had where someone doesn't ask, where are you really from? So, you know, this idea of belonging and where is home is a question I ask myself a lot, and it has changed quite a bit. So for a long time, I really felt like home was achievement for me. It was really like about education and accomplishment. And I felt like that felt like home to me, like writing, learning, all these things felt like a place where I got the most comfort. So I don't know. I mean, I think after I asked myself that question a lot, and it changes. Like in this moment, I would say probably my children, like is where I feel the most at home. And, you know, my husband, like that is a space where I feel like the most comfortable when I think about where I'm at most peace.
That's interesting. So home is a place where you feel the peace. So when you feel peace, you're home. I think about that sometimes because I think about what I think of as home. I don't always feel peaceful there, but I know that's my home.
That place.
So it's almost like home as a metaphor versus home as an actual place or where you're from. One thing that was really interested, speaking of going back and forth to home, was the question of plastic surgery in this story. I can't get over it. Like the aunt returns to the Dominican Republic for plastic surgery. And I think that plastic surgery is not really a narrative that we really associate with Black women, with women of color, but this idea of searching for the perfect body. Can you talk about the way that plays out in this book?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I can't even get over the fact that Tayari Jones read my book. I mean, she gave me a blurb a long time ago, but I'm like, oh, you really read it.
I read it.
It feels good. So, I mean, one of the things that I was really interested in asking of this book is like, what does it mean to be at home? And what does it mean to be in places that are hostile to you, that are supposed to be home? And that question for me was especially important when it comes to womanhood. And to us women, when our own bodies become places of hostility for us. And I was thinking, especially as women of color, as Black Latinas, you know, being a bigger, which is what happens to Cuca, is that she gains a lot of weight. And it's different because there are other characters in the book who are very happy to be big, you know? And like Cuca gains a lot of weight because she's unhappy because her husband's cheating on her. And she finds in his phone, like all these pictures of women that he's been with, and they're all like super young. And obviously they've had cosmetic surgery. So she decides to go back to DR to get a cosmetic procedure that I made up thinking I was groundbreaking, and then came to find out it's a real thing in DR. It's like, is art imitating life or is life imitating art? So she goes back to DR to get this Altagracia complete makeover. And Altagracia is the patron saint of the Dominican Republic. And so she like goes, and it's like a fat farm, you lose weight, and then you get like from head to toe, everything done. And then they throw in like a re-virginalization, like at the end for all the work she does. So I really wanted to explore in this way that is really important to me, because the mother, Eusebia, is so adamantly opposed to this. She's like, you're risking your life. This is ridiculous. I can't believe you would even consider doing this. And she's not going to a reputable place. Like she's going to like the equivalent of a 99-cent store to get, you know, all these procedures done. So she becomes ill through these procedures. And then Luz, on the other hand, is more, you know, she's younger, and she's like, you know, as women, we can win. The standards are always out of our reach. We are always being asked to look different, to be different. We can't blame women for trying. Yet we do blame and criticize women when they do these plastic procedures. So, you know, I wanted to have this question in the book and the situation for Cuca, where she's really interested in doing whatever it takes to feel at home in her body. And she's unapologetic about it. She's doing it because she wants to capture her husband's attention, and she does it, and she achieves that to a certain extent. And then things change, you know, through the book, the course of the book. But that question to me of like, what is home and how do we fit the standard or not fit the standard? I'll say this, when I started writing this book, and this is how long it took me to write this book, it was when people got surgery done. It was, you know, especially coming from the Dominican Republic, where, you know, it's become one of these meccas where people go for surgery now. And people used to do like the surgeries that they would do would be very subtle. So like you wouldn't really be able to tell if you got your breast done or a tummy tuck. And then over the course of time, it became more and more exaggerated, where like the surgery itself became a status symbol. So looking fake, it looking like you had obviously done it, became part of why you would do it, because it would be like only certain people would be able to afford it. And then, you know, I just remember having this moment when I came back into the book, because I wasn't writing continuously for all those years. I left the book and then came back to it. And I just remember maybe 5 years ago coming back to the book and being like, oh, this is not an exaggeration at all. Like now we're living in the, you know, in this time when it's really become the standard that everybody's getting their ass done. Everybody's getting their breast done. Everybody's getting, you know, tummy tucks, and like everybody's looking very similar. Their faces are looking, you know, especially with social media. And so for me, that was a very sobering moment where I was like, oh, I was trying to ask these really provocative questions that I thought would be, you know, satirical. Like the idea that someone would go to a country and do their entire bodies, to me was like an absurdity. But it isn't that far from what's happening today.
Well, I feel like I couldn't resist asking that, because I was intrigued by that, and particularly, you know, like that those people who went to Mexico for plastic surgery and got abducted. All of that has really been in the news, the way that people who, particularly people of color, are going to these, like you said, the equivalent of the 99-cent store, the bargain place to get things done. But I feel like I have pulled you away from the actual plot of the story. So here's the plot of this story. The neighborhood's getting gentrified, and Luz's mother has this idea that she will halt the gentrification by becoming, the mother herself is going to become a crime wave. This is her idea on how she's going to stop it. And I don't want to spoil it.
Yeah.
But you realize there's more going on with mom than just this bright idea. Would you be willing to read a little bit so we can get a sense of that?
Yes. So I'm gonna read just a couple of pages from chapter 4. I'm just gonna give a little taste of it, and all you need to know is that Eusebia is the mother character, and the day before she fell down in the park, and this is what happens when she wakes up. A list would stop it all. On Wednesday afternoon, Eusebia woke up and left her apartment just like that. She didn't empty her bladder. She didn't bother changing out of the clothes she still wore from the day before. She didn't brush her teeth. She didn't knock on Luz's door. The slimy feeling that coated her teeth was familiar, from giving birth twice, from leaving her country to come to this new place. Those times she'd ended up with a dirty mouth that lasted for days too, even after she brushed her teeth. Her head ached, pulsed, but she decided to ignore it. She should be thirsty, but she wasn't that either. The world seemed a bit distant, and she really liked it. She'd pretend nothing was wrong until she got a handle on things on herself. In her sleep, she solved the problem on how they'd stop the construction, how they'd stop the apartments from being sold. It came folded inside a terrifying memory of the last time she'd visited the Dominican Republic. On the first floor, she rang the bell to her best friend's apartment. One of the women opened the door. "Let's go for a walk," she said. Her friend nodded, went to get the others. Moments later, they were outside where the day was bright, the weather warmer than it should be. Eusebia's body felt sore, as if she'd actually gone for a long swim. She moved gingerly. The noise from the construction site got louder as they approached. Huge chunks of concrete were being dropped into a metal dumpster, sending sharp chills from their teeth to the bones of their jaws. The dust still lingered in the air, and all four of them fanned at the sting in their eyes. Her best friends, the tongues, blinked repeatedly, tears rolling down their cheeks. They didn't wipe them away. Eusebia's eyes got red from the dust, but none of her tears fell. "What happened to you yesterday?" one of the women asked. It was a strange way to ask the question. Eusebia turned the words in her mind. Had she heard what was said? "I don't know," she said. The women nodded like they knew what she meant, but she was sure they didn't. "Jose died," one of the women said. Eusebia didn't know who Jose was. "I'm really sorry," she said, searching for her mind for that name. "The boy," the three of them said at once, annoyed, hurt. "Go home." Someone had carved into the skin of a young boy's back. She remembered. The banging ahead culminated in a huge crashing sound. Because the empty space of the missing building was so wide, the echo was magnified. It shook them. The tongues smiled self-consciously. How silly to be startled by noise. "You feeling okay?" one of the women asked, all three of them eyeing her up and down. She had stopped walking. "Better snap out of it," she told herself. She shrugged, moved. How to describe it to her friends? She felt like herself, but also as if something important had happened to that self, and she could appreciate it from a distance, like her body belonged to someone else. Had the fall loosened someone within her? She put the thought out of her mind. What she was about to say would be crazy enough. Her idea required them to trust she hadn't lost her mind. "I have an idea on how to stop all of this from happening," she said. The tongues looked at her curiously. "What if we just scare everyone into thinking this neighborhood is really bad?" she said. The women smiled, thinking at a joke, brilliant in its simplicity. "How would we do that?" they asked. Eusebia could clearly see the unvoiced thought that it would be too easy to work. Eusebia then spoke in a confident way, as if this conversation had already happened. She explained she meant recruiting their neighbors, who would act out crimes throughout the neighborhood with other volunteers who would be the victims of these crimes. "You mean fake crimes?" they asked. "No, not fake, real. Who'd be crazy enough to move to a neighborhood amid a crime spree?" "What kind of crimes?" they asked. Eusebia was quiet. She had come up with a list, but she knew if they participated, helped formulate it, they'd really be in. "What would scare you?" she asked. "What would be bad enough?" I'll stop there.
How did you come up with that idea?
So, the summer when I moved back, to my neighborhood, I remember that there were all these buildings that were being knocked down, and it like happened very, very quickly. And I just remember there being this sense that people, like, the fear was underneath something else, like this anger. Like, people just felt really enraged at the way things were happening in the neighborhood. And one day I remember there was this poster that someone had posted that just said, "Be careful, there's a rapist." And it was just like a handwritten sign. And there were around the park, I lived across a park, and like around the park, there were these kind of signs. And I just noticed people walking by the sign and not looking at it. And I was like, wait a minute, is there really a rapist? Like, shouldn't we all be scared? So that was the first thought that, kind of made this thing sparkle in my mind, like ignited something that was that would shine from time to time. And then, at the same time, Columbia University was like making a very aggressive move to buy all this property on the west side, which is a little bit farther than from where I lived. And I just remember a lot of the women, a lot of the resistance that was happening in my neighborhood, a lot of the revolt was being done by the women in the community. And I thought about how often when there is a revolution, when there is, these moments of revolt, how often it is men who are centered as the leaders of those revolutions. And I was young. I mean, I was probably like, early 20s. But I just remember like when people were talking about who was showing up to the community board meetings, it was always like women and like the grandmas and the, you know, the stay-at-home moms, right? And so not people that we would ever consider being the people who stand up and revolt against displacement. And so that's when I really started thinking about like, oh, these rolos, like, you know, roller wearing woman, mom being like, fuck this, like I'm stopping it, you know? And I thought also about like what I noticed when people were walking by those signs was like, not like people weren't scared because whoever was doing those crimes wouldn't do it to people from the community. So I was thinking about like, who is this sign meant to scare? Because so many people were walking by it not affected by the warning. And so then I started thinking about it, like how insane would it be if people actually came up with a plan to just scare rich people from moving into a community? Like I was like, I think it would work.
I got a question for you. This is something I've been asking myself. Can you gentrify your own hometown? Can you gentrify your own neighborhood?
I mean,
asking for a friend.
I think so, yes. So, I mean, part of the reason why I wanted Luz to be in a very complicated situation, Luz ends up falling in love with the developer of this and having a very sexy affair with this man.
It is super sexy. It's like...
So, you know, one of the things that I was thinking about is how when we talk about gentrification, we talk about the force of displacement. It's always like done in this kind of stark light where it's like bad, bad, bad. But in reality, gentrification, just like capitalism, is quite seductive. I mean, like, who doesn't want to live in a better building? Who doesn't want to have like nice elevators? Who doesn't want amenities and restaurants and like bottomless mimosas and like nice places to, like, who doesn't, you know? So the question isn't whether or not we want these amenities in our neighborhoods, but it's, for me, the bigger question is like, why does it take a certain type of people, upper middle class, for developers to be willing to make those investments in our community? And so, you know, when I was about 24 years old, they knocked down one of these buildings and they said that they would set apart like 40% of the units for people from the community. And people from the community didn't have to meet the standard of the salary that the other people coming from outside would have to meet. And I was one of the people who got the lottery. So I got to buy an apartment when I was 25 years old in one of these luxury. And mine wasn't like as fancy as it got eventually in that neighborhood. Mine was a co-op. So it was very nice. It was nicer than anywhere I had ever lived. But I would still say it was like a reasonable place where people could afford to live from the neighborhood. Eventually, they kept like partitioning these percentages aside, but it became less and less reasonable that people from the neighborhood could do it. But what I remember about moving, when I moved into this, and I was very proud, like I had saved so much money, and I had to have a roommate to afford it, but I was willing to do it. And I remember when I moved in, my brother-in-law came. He was helping me like repair some things and paint. And the security guard downstairs was like, "Oh, your food delivery is here." And I just saw in his face, because there was a camera, like he was heartbroken to be like called. Not that there was anything wrong with that, but the idea that just because he's coming and he's dressed a certain way, he must be a service person. And so, you know, it just became really interesting to me because like even when I was coming into the building, it was like whoever was white that lived in the building, people assumed lived there, but whoever was not white was assumed to be a guest or, you know, whatever else. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of like how, like the kinds of questions and the kind of ridiculous assumptions we make about each other when, like, you know, when change comes to a neighborhood. But more interesting for me, because I was working in corporate America, because I, you know, very quickly changed my class in my neighborhood, in my house, in my family. Like for me, it felt like the same thing. Like, it's interesting because before you were like, oh, I'm taking you away from the plot by talking about Kuka. And like part of what I wanted to do with this book was to show how all of it is like the central nerve is the same. Like the same force that makes us feel like our bodies aren't good enough if they don't look one way is the same force that makes us think, you know, it's the same force. It's capitalism, right? It's the same force that's going to displace people from their homes. It's the same force that would make someone feel like you're not good enough to cut it in corporate America, right? Unless you are sound, speak, behave a certain way. And all of these things, what they're asking us to do is cut away who we are in a big way, you know, to belong, or give up a lot to belong. So yeah, so for me, I do think that it's possible to gentrify your own neighborhood, even if you are someone who historically has been from that place. Because I think it's more about mentality and class than it is about. What do you think?
Well, I think you can, but I also think that, like where I live, I was telling her that where I live used to be a cement factory. So I feel more comfortable living there, even though the neighborhood is gentrifying. I don't have to feel like someone's going to say, my grandmother lived here, you displaced my grandmother, you know, unless your grandmother was a rock. This is not going to happen. And that was very helpful for me. But I do feel that like if a place has been changed and it has been made more expensive, if you buying a house at a certain rate is raising everybody's property taxes, displacing people's grandmothers, then you can gentrify your own neighborhood. But at the same time, I feel that, I don't know, it's very, I've been thinking a lot about this idea, particularly in Atlanta, since we have some of the greatest income inequality in the country. Mm-hmm. I like to feel like I am from Atlanta. I live in Atlanta. As a matter of fact, I make sure I live in Fulton County. I live right in East Atlanta, right? Well, actually, I don't live in East Atlanta. East Atlanta is 3 blocks from me. So I'm on the Atlanta side of the Atlanta. And it means, I feel like it means a lot to me, but I'm also watching the city change. And I don't know, I'm unsure of like, what is my responsibility as a native Atlantan on this changing landscape. Now, before we open it up to questions, you have one more question for you.
Okay.
Explain this title, Neruda on the Park.
Yeah. So Neruda is after Pablo Neruda, who is a famous poet, a Latin American poet, and was the first Latin American person to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And so I really love Pablo Neruda's poetry. It is, you know, some of the most beautiful poetry that I've ever read. And I also think that Pablo Neruda as a human being was really interesting because he spoke a lot and advocated a lot for how all literature should be accessible to everyone. So whether you're someone who is sweeping the street or a doctor, like everyone should be able to enjoy and appreciate and understand your literature. So like the job of the artist is to make art that is accessible to everybody. And then at the same time, this man was known to have been like a rapist. Like in his own biography, he spoke about raping a cleaning woman. And I was really interested in this idea of like, what do we do with this toxic masculinity? Like, what do we do with the art of these men who are problematic? And in Chile, at one point while I was working on this book, there was a big move to erect a building in Pablo Neruda's name. And like the feminists were like, over our dead bodies. So it was like immediate, like absolutely not, you know? And I was thinking about how in this country, like the people who are still teaching Pablo Neruda's art, like you never hear about this problematic part, like the fact that he admitted in his own, you can just Google it, Pablo Neruda rapist, and you're going to see like the Washington Post and other places talking about in the context of this memoir. And so, you know, I really was really interested in thinking about this complication of the language and the beauty of the language. I was interested in thinking about what do we do with people, especially men who have wronged women, people, and then like what do we do with their art? Because it's without a question, Pablo Neruda, you know, has contributed some of the most important poetry to the literary tradition. So I just wanted that to be a little subversive too, because I feel like when people look at this and they're like, I love Pablo Neruda. And I'm like, you should read this book. And I remember like, you know, people have been in touch with me through like Instagram, people who haven't read the book. And they're like, I don't know why you would call your book. Do you know about him? And I was like, read the book, you know, because like at one point at the end, there's a question that one of the characters is asking, like, why is this building that's going up called Neruda on the Park? Like, why isn't it called Alvarez on the Park or Morrison on the Park, or, you know? And it's like a bigger question that I think I ask myself when I think about who again is lauded in letters, you know, and despite their shortcomings. So the other thing about this title is that I wanted to try to do something that's really, really nerdy, and I feel like no one has seen it yet. So this is top secret. So, you know, at the beginning of the book, each section has a title that is connected to something that's going to happen in that scene. So I wanted to do it as a way to kind of like make you feel really like I'm holding your hand and leading you into the book. At one point, the subject titles disassociate from the text, and they are actually like parts of the poetry from Pablo Neruda's body of work, and you will not find that in the book. So if you know Pablo Neruda's poetry, then you'll know that some of these little phrases are from another text. So then the book becomes disassociated from itself, which is what some of the characters in the book are dealing with. They're dealing with disassociation. And then at the end, the headings fall apart, like they're completely disappeared. And some of them by design, because there are certain things that have disappeared from the story. So you understand that the disappearance is standing in place of something. And then other times the disappearance is just like a blankness, so that you can start to find meaning in the text. And then by the end, I go back to like putting little headers that tell you what's going to happen. Because I was thinking a lot about the book as an artifact. And if the book is an artifact, the way that a city is an artifact and it is reflective, it reflects itself, but then it also reflects things that are not of itself. And so, yeah, so it was just like a super nerdy thing that I did. And I had a lot of fun being like, let me put puzzles in the book that, you know, only the nerdiest person would figure it out, or would ask a question like, why is this book a book? Because to me, that's also an important thing. Like, I could just tell you a story about this mother, but like if the book is an artifact, there should be a reason why it's an artifact. And for me, it has to do with the actual letters and the words in the book.
Let us open it up to questions from the audience.
I know 90% of the people here. So you guys better ask me some questions.
Thanks, both of you, for being here tonight. I love both of your work. Cleyvis, so I don't know if you know this, but I teach for Lehman College in the Bronx. And 90% of the student body is second or third generation from Spanish-speaking countries. And one thing I've noticed is that my students, especially most of them, live in the Bronx or Washington Heights, or and I noticed that when I give them the opportunity to write about, I try to get them to write about real life stuff. And I'm like, be autobiographical if you want to, you know, I just don't want you writing about dragons. And I find that it's really hard to get them to write about the things I know that they are experiencing, like gentrification, for example. And I was just wondering if you think that that's a generational thing of like, leave it alone. Don't, you know, do you have any insight?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. Thank you, Deshaun. I think, I do think that it's really difficult to write about something when you're in it. You know, I found that when I went away to college and I took my first creative writing class, I was writing about vampires, you know, like I wanted to be like Anne Rice. And so, you know, I think it's also really interesting how like when you're younger, like what you think is most interesting is the thing that's the farthest from you. And that it's not very often that I think young people think of their own lives as like a place for the imagination to be at play. Or, you know, we're not told that those stories are that important at times. So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing that I've learned when I'm teaching, because I volunteer for like Dominican writers, so I go to this salon that they do. And what you know, just as a tip, what I do is that I give very pointed like prompts. So one of the prompts I give them to find their voice is to like write a story they've heard over and over again from their families, and to write it from the best person in their family that tells the story. And you have to do it like as verbatim as much as you can. And then the second part of that, and it's usually like about some chisme about the family, you know, some, you know, family lore. It's usually something that has happened in the neighborhood. It's very often something very personal. And then the second part of that exercise is for them to try to consider how their voice is different from that person, and to change the story, tell the same story, but now tell it from their own voice. And that I find like has really opened something, because in the second part, I also want them to fictionalize, so exaggerate, add structure, add plot, make it interesting, so that the story has movement. And so for my students, I found that to be a way to like show them how, you know, there is like the fodder for the stories already in your family, and like it's really funny or interesting, and you can start there versus trying to, you know, write about dragons. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it also is a matter of models. Like you said, you wrote about vampires because you read Anne Rice.
Yeah.
Like what you see in a book is what you think is book worthy. I think that matters. I think that matters a lot.
Yeah. Giving examples that are confronting some of the issues that they are confronting in their lives.
Yes, and if they want to write about dragons, I don't know what is up with the dragons, but it's a real thing. You know, also it can even be for some students to be a big step to write about a character like themselves in the same story with the dragon, right? Because there is a sort of whiteness of genre and genre stuff. You know, if there must be dragons.
I mean, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, aside from everything with Junot Diaz, like that was a big book for that reason, right? That all of a sudden there were all these genre elements in a book that folks could see themselves in.
I do think there's been a huge, such an expansion in the kinds of things that people of color are writing about, and who feel and are publishing. I'm going to say that people of color are publishing, because I do think that I'm sure that somewhere in the world there is an ancient text of somebody writing about, say, Black vampires, you know. So what is written and what is published are two different things.
Yeah.
And I do think we tend to think, what are Black people or other people of color, what are they thinking about based on what is being published? But I don't think we'll ever know what all has been written. I'm sure it's interesting things that would kind of blow our minds in terms of what is the conversation.
I agree.
I hope I can formulate this as a question that it doesn't just ramble on, but I find this conversation in your book very interesting. I have not read your book, and I'm excited now to read it. I work as a developer currently, and it's just on a small property. I am endlessly fascinated by the possibility for writers, especially writers of color, to be involved in conversations about development without it being from a position of reacting. And I guess my question really would be, if you could envision a way to be involved in development, is that something that anyone has ever asked? Is that a room or a space that you've ever even thought about walking into? Because I got to tell you, developers are the least, I'm trying to be diplomatic, but I don't know why. They're not thinkers. They're some of the laziest thinkers that I've ever met. And they tend to just do the same thing over and over because someone else has done it, or they just can't fathom doing it a different way. So if writers were to envision a landscape, and if we were to be invited into that space, what would that look like for you?
Oh, wow. That's a beautiful question. And really hard. I mean, you know, I think one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, even in the construction of this fictional neighborhood, I mean, I was really deliberate about not placing it in a real neighborhood in New York City. Nothar Park is a fictional town. And part of the reason why I wanted to make it a fictional town is because I wanted to collapse the boundaries between the boroughs. So like Nothar Park is a park in the middle, and then each of the parts of the each of the 4 sides of the park resembles a combination of places I have lived in New York City. So there's like a part that's the Bronx, there's a part that's Washington Heights, there's a part that's Brooklyn, there's a part that's, you know, I went to school down in NYU, so it's like the West Village-y. And, you know, I was thinking a lot about the assumptions we make, even the sizes of the buildings. So some of the houses around the park are like brownstones, some are tenement buildings, some are like the squat kind of 3 or 4 story buildings. And I was thinking a lot about spaces and like what it means to like the tenement, you know, and how dangerous they were for immigrants, for example, and how I've been thinking about this really recently because very recently, the mayor of New York City started talking about like, why do we need windows in bedrooms? Like, why don't we go back to spaces where like people share a bathroom, you know, just to make more spaces for people to live. And it seemed to me like, you know, outrageous that like we're having these conversations now, because really we're talking about the dignity of poor people. We're not talking about wealthy people living in a room without a window or without running water. Like we're talking about poor people, and like what do poor people deserve again? So yeah, so I think it's a wonderful question to think about, like how just getting writers involved. I think getting artists period involved in conversations about city, because we all know, anybody that has even talked to like urban planners knows that it's usually very class-based. Sabe is like putting her head down because she's guilty as charged. But, you know, to me, it's like I got really, and I went down some rabbit holes when I was writing this book, like really finding out the history of cities and, you know, why some cities don't have sidewalks, why some cities don't have, you know. So, you know, I don't have an answer in terms of how different it would look, but I think like having artists being involved in conversations about the function of space and like what it would mean to have dignity take into account when we're thinking about creating spaces that serve communities and not that serve the goal of making money, which I think is a lot of times how we think about spaces. I think that's like a place to start. What do you think?
I heard a developer saying that the key to affordable housing is that it has to be housing that you want to live there, not just because it's what you can afford. That affordable housing work if other people want to live in it. Like you want your affordable housing to be such that people who don't qualify for it get mad because they would like to live there, and that's how you know you've done it right. But one thing, if I could just like fantasize, since we're developing together, we are right now in our imaginations. I would like more libraries. I would like more. I want to bring libraries back where people go to libraries all the time. Like, remember you were a little kid, how you loved the library? The librarian was like a magical person. I wish we could make libraries sexy again and make libraries a welcoming place to children. This has nothing to do with your question, but when I was a child, there was a thing called the Georgia Book List. I don't know if it still exists. And you could get prizes for having read books off the Georgia Book List. And then when you got back to school, your class would make something to celebrate the Georgia Book List. Nobody asked me about this, but I'm just going to say this. I hope my fifth grade teacher is watching. So we made a quilt for the Georgia Book List. We had to learn how to sew, and every child was given one square you had to make to celebrate the book you wanted to. You took it home, you learned how to sew, and we brought the squares back. And the teacher, I now know the teacher went home and made them symmetrical and made it work. But she led us to believe that we had made a quilt. And at the end of the school year, I asked, we won a prize we won a blue ribbon. End of the school year, I waited till all the other children were gone. And I asked the teacher, could I take the quilt home for the summer? And she said no, because the quilt was not for any one child. It was for the whole class. And the next year I could come and look at it. And I was so embarrassed. I felt like I had overstepped, that I had asked for something that was inappropriate. And I was so ashamed. I even forgot some of my things behind. I was too embarrassed to go back and get them. Flash forward 25 years. So I've written my first book. It got reviewed like 3 places. Well, at my job, I got a box in the mail. I opened the box. And I opened the box and I just took out one corner and I was like, oh my God, it's a Georgia book quilt. She saw my book reviewed in the AJC and she saw that I was teaching in Illinois, and she mailed it to me. She said that when she retired, she was taking all the stuff out of her classroom, and she said she remembered the little girl who wanted the quilt, and she could not bring herself to discard it because she felt bad when I walked out like this.
Aww.
And then so I have it in my house. True story. It involves a library. That's my point. This is a story that involves a library. So I would like to bring libraries back when we make our hypothetical development. I want a library and I want everybody to use it. And I don't want any fines, because I feel like little kids, they can't pay the fine. It's like $1, but they think it's a lot of money and they don't come back. So I'll pay their fines. You call me, I will pay all the fines. Okay, that's all. That's my thought.
Tayari for president. That's beautiful.
Can we see the quilt sometime? We post it somewhere so we can see it.
I should bring it somewhere. I mean, it's in my house, but I would, if like when we make our library, we can frame the Georgia book quilt and we'll put it on the wall in our library. Okay.
I love that.
I love that.
One of the things that we think about a lot is like, how we position your book in conversation with other books. So obviously like who you're going to be in conversation with in your event, but also then how do we position your book on social media and then literally on the shelf. And so what are some books that might sit next to yours on a shelf? And maybe what's one book that might surprise folks that you're like, well, obviously this book is meant to be on my shelf, but people might not know it.
Well, I mean, I will say that if you read my book, there is a bibliography of books in the book that I think, and there are books like Killing the Black Body and Julia Auris's In the Name of Salome. It's Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. As I was writing this book and I was reading books that I thought the book was in conversation with, I would put the book in the book. And I also thought that was like a neat way of having the book be in conversation. But more recently, I mean, I really cannot get over myself and like how amazing it is to be alive and be a reader right now, because I think we're living through some of the most exciting and amazing fiction. And so I love Donnie Walton's The Final Revival of Oprah and Neff, Robert Jones Jr., The Prophets. I love Naima Coster's What's Mine and Yours. I love Sakia Dalila Harris wrote The Other Black Girl. And I really love that. Very recently, I've been like reading, I really love debuts. That's my jam. So I've been really obsessed with the work of we were talking about Tomorrow, which I just read. You loved it. Like that book is kind of perfect. So I think that's a book that like it might be surprising because I didn't read it while I was writing this book. But I think, that is a book that's really dealing with like the complications of friendship. And my book is really concerned with like the complications of friendship. So I'll stop there because I can talk about
tomorrow. She also says that it's a book about failure.
Yeah.
That it's a book about failure. And I was thinking, we read so little about failure, although we experience failure, because books are supposed to be about success. The stories we tell all have to have that up loop at the end with success. So you talk about failure as a way to get to success, but not sitting with it. And I feel like I love the way that book really deals with it. When they make that weird game that flops, that living with failure and deciding to move. And not failure as a strategy for success, but just as something that happens to you. And you may have success later, but it's not because of your failure. Failure just be happening.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of the books that I love to read are books where like the character transformation isn't neat. And I think a lot of times when I think the publishing industry assumes that people come to fiction because they want to see that this kind of beautiful transformation where somebody becomes good by the end, but I'm really interested in thinking about how grief turns people into monsters, how like, capitalism and like the patriarchy have locked inside most of our bodies rage that if left unlocked would like consume us. So I'm really interested in thinking about the monstrosity and like the bigger than life characters.
But these
so any
people,
books
they
like,
get it together.
They get it
They
together.
get it together.
They do.
They get it together.
It's a satisfying book.
Yeah, it's a very sad. They get it together. Don't let her scare you. They get it together.
Thank you. To sell books.
So I'm going to sort of combine a couple of questions, because one of the things that struck me about this book is that I'm an urban planner, as you know, and it was really interesting to think through all the different questions of like, how do you save a community? How do you deal with this? How do you sort of absorb it? And as you were saying, I would say that development is very formulaic, and this book is not formulaic. It's very surprising in a lot of different ways. I'm curious to know what your publishing process was like because of that. Like, what were some of the things that you had to struggle with sort of getting through the process, because it is so surprising in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for the compliment. I actually like really, for me, like I would say that the construction of the book came late. So thinking about so the book is split into 3 parts, and the first part is demolition. The second part is excavation. And the third part is grounding. And all of those are, 2 parts of it is actually like a project management phase of construction. And the third part is a subset. And I only learned this because I spent a lot of time on the internet learning about all these things about construction. And like one thing that I would say that I really wanted to do once I really knew the story, because I would say like one of the biggest hindrances to getting this book out of my head is that I kept changing my mind about what the book was. And so, once I settled on what this book being a book about, this community at risk, these 2 women that are in crisis, and then like one mother trying to save the community to the point where she puts it at greater risk than it was. And then like, how do these 2 women find personal liberation and love? To me, that was really a big question about love. And so once I decided that, then it became simpler to say, like, what can I do with a structure that would then surprise? So like the conceit for part 1 was that I was not gonna regress. Like I didn't want to go into flashbacks. So any flashbacks, because it's demolition, it's about like both the women's lives coming undone and the building coming undone, And so for me, like I was thinking really like in a very physical way about the book and like what I wanted to see happen. I would say too, I love being surprised. And to me, the key to surprise is creating characters who learn something about themselves they didn't know. Because I think a lot of times, at least in my own writing process, I find that sometimes we're ahead of the story as the narrators. Like we've already made up our minds what's going to happen to the character. And so it's almost like the character's always catching up to our imagination through their actions. And that to me gives any story like, it feels like stilted. And so one of the things that I decided to do with this book is that like my characters could not get ahead of the story. And I gave myself room to be surprised. And a lot of the surprises really came from the character's past and like unlocking the past for both of them. So I think like those are some of the tricks I have for like creating more surprising stories. What are your tricks? Tell us.
Well, I was curious, as she said, about the route to publication. You have written such a remarkable novel. Did you have trouble finding a publisher?
Yeah, I mean, I got kicked in the teeth a lot on my way to public. I mean, I think the first thing that happened to me is that because this book was, came at the heels of a failed book, I decided that I was just gonna write a book that was foolproof, just sexy and, about like a young woman having lots of sex, like I was just going to write something that like I was going to get published. And I wasn't even planning to put my name on it when I first came up with it. But the story really kept being complicated by this mother and by the relationship. And I think as I became more conscious of myself as a person, the book also became more complicated and more reflective of my ideas and my values of like what I want literature to do to a reader in terms of like what questions I want someone to ask themselves. But when I think about the way the book changed, this book started out as a first person narrative, a coming of age of one woman, a young woman. Then it became this first plural by the tongue. So the whole book was told from the perspective of these three women, and they had like more mystical abilities, like they could go in and out of the, and then I was like, oh, this book is about community. And so it was like about everyone that had volunteered to do a crime. So each character had a chapter, and like the story moved that way. And you know, there were so many times when I felt like the book, now in hindsight, you know, I couldn't get an agent. Like I tried, and then I became very discouraged. So I stopped writing and I put the book away, and I just focused on my corporate job and other priorities that I had. And, you know, it wasn't until I got my current agent, who's amazing, hi PJ, that then I had someone who's like really helping me to think about the book. And we went through some revisions, but at that point, like he really believed in the book. And, you know, the edits that we did weren't to the story. It was really more about character. But when I got that agent, it made me realize that I just hadn't approached it with like a business mind. I think I spent a lot of time second guessing myself because of so much failure and changing the story in ways that I don't think really served the story. And I think that this book should have become a book earlier. And I think, no, I'm very proud of the book that it is, because I do think it became more remarkable as I became a better writer. But I, you know, now looking back at it, I'm like, oh yes, there is systemic oppression. Like, you know, I didn't think that was true, honestly. Like I felt like the book is not finding a path because the book isn't very good. And now when I think about the story and the books that existed before this final version, I think those books also deserved a shot. So I think it's just also knowing that it, like for some of us, it's just going to be harder. And I wish that I hadn't given up as many times as I did.
And I think that it is going to be, I think it's hard for everyone. That's one thing that teaching has taught me. Everybody thinks whoever they are has the hardest time.
Yeah.
Like everyone is like, you know, like you can meet like straight white guys like, yeah, but I'm from West Virginia. You know what I mean? I don't live in New York. And they feel in their heart, they feel that way. Like nobody feels that publishing works for them. Like everyone's like, oh my God, it's so terrible. I can't tell you how horrible it was. But I do think that publishing is really expanding. I look at how, like there used to be so few Black women publishing. Yes. Anytime a Black woman published a book, I would tell, girl, call me, I'll talk to you. Mm-hmm. It was enough of them, but I could talk to each one of them for an hour and a half. And it wasn't a significant thing that I did with my time. It didn't happen so much. And I used to read and offer blurbs to as many people as possible, because there weren't that many people senior to the debut people who could write their blurbs. But now there are just so many more. They blurb each other. Like I'm just like, have at it, y'all. There's just so many more. Yeah. So I have just seen a massive shift. Yeah. And I know that it is difficult for everyone, but then they're different. I find there are also different challenges for different people. Like we were just saying that, like, I believe that people of color have a harder route to getting published, but once you get published, you have a better chance of getting attention, because you're seen as different and remarkable in that way. Where I have a lot of writer friends who are white women, they can't get any attention. They can get their books published, but they can't get any attention. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we all pay a lot of dues. We pay the toll booths are at different places on our journeys. Mm. But I also do believe that if you do your work with your whole heart, I know I feel like I'm the old person in this conversation, but hear me out. If you do your work with your whole heart, that doors will in fact open for you. I've had things happen to me that you won't believe. I'm gonna tell one story. I know it's not my event, but I got a story.
Please.
When I wrote my third book, I couldn't get a publisher. When I wrote my third book, is because this thing had just been invented called BookScan, where they have an app where they can see how many books you sell. And it was new. So, you know, whenever technology is new, everybody's using it. Before BookScan, you could behave like a successful person and people would think you were successful. But with BookScan, you can behave however you want. They were like, they just they had reduced you to a number. And so I didn't have good numbers. And so my publisher, they kicked me to the curb. They didn't want me anymore. I couldn't get a contract. We were sending the manuscript out and nobody wanted it because they were all looking at the BookScan. But I wrote that my third book as a gift to my older sister. We hadn't grown up together, and I wanted her to know that I had missed her all my life. Mm-hmm. And so when the book was getting rejected, I kept revising it because I was thinking, I tell my students, you write the book you're called to write. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stop revising my book because some computer program has told me, then how can I face these kids every day? So I finished the book. I had one speaking engagement left on my calendar. I didn't want to go. I was embarrassed because my book, I didn't have a contract, and my other books have been taken out of print because they weren't making the money either. And they had just discovered that print on demand. So they were like, we don't have to print any books. It was new technology. But only reason I went to the last speaking event is because I was the only Black person invited. And I was worried that if I didn't show up in the future, they wouldn't invite anyone. They would say, we tried diversity. It didn't come. So I showed up and I gave my little reading off my little piece of paper. I was so embarrassed, but I did the best I could. And I sat down at the table knowing I would have no books to sign because my books were out of print. And a lady came up to my book table and she said, oh my goodness, I've heard what happened to you. It's terrible what's happening to young people these days. I just don't know what these publishers are doing. I hear they have something on their phones. And I was like, yes, ma'am. I was so embarrassed. And she said, I can help you. She carried me by the hand through the crowd, put my hand in the hand of a publisher. I didn't take it seriously because I knew that publisher was going to get that app and reject me. So I was just trying to be polite, but I was trying to get away. I was so embarrassed. I just wanted to cry. I felt so defeated. And the publisher lady said, but wait, before you go, because I can see you're trying to leave, what's your book about? I told her. And then she said, but one more thing. And I said, yes. She said, you didn't tell me yet how you and Judy know each other. And I said, I don't know anybody named Judy. And she said, no, I'm talking about Judy Bloom, who just introduced us. And she was on the Georgia Book Quilt. And that was on a Thursday. And I had my book deal on a Monday. I was back in business. But so my students, they say, well, you see, Professor, it's all about who you know. And I tell them, no, it's about doing your work, because I had that book finished as good as I could make it. I did everything I could to that book. That book I did my part. So once you do your part, I hate to sound like my grandma, but once you do your part, God will do the rest. It's true. But and that happened to me. I had experiences like that more than once in my writing career. I wanted to go to school for writing. I didn't know. I was afraid to. I wrote a failed novel. I published 10 pages of it, 10 pages in a little literary magazine. It probably had a circulation of 8. And one of them was my mama. I literally ran into a writer in an elevator. I'm really tall. I'm sitting down. You can't tell. And so I didn't see her. She's petite. And I was like, oh my God, petite person. I'm so sorry. I was all stressed out. I've been this tall since I was 12. I always knew it was a matter of time for something like this happen. And she was fine. And I told her my name. And she had read that one. Out of those 8 people that read them, one of them was this woman that I ran into in the elevator, literally. She invited me to come work with her and get my MFA because I did my part. And that's what you just got to keep doing your part. Art will find a way. You will find a way. So just if there's anybody that's got a book you're trying to write, something you're struggling with, just do the best you can and do your part. Don't worry. You know how they say you got to write every day to write? You don't have to write every day. That's something that I think discourages working people of color, because you think, well, I can't write every day, so I can't do this. But the things that are keeping you from writing every day, your work, your family, your kids, all the things you do in your community, those are the things that you're going to write about. So these things that are keeping you from writing are what is going to make your writing good. You got to figure out how to make time for both. You don't have to write every day. Just write frequently. If you can give me 3 days a week, if you will write when other people are in the gym, you can have your book done in 2 years. So just do it. Just take your time. Your story is important. I was telling these people today at breakfast, I don't want to read a book by somebody who's sitting around in their pajamas all day with nothing to do but write. I want to read a book by someone who's living a meaningful life, which means I want to read a book by somebody like you.
You just got a whole MFA tonight. Y'all, thank you so much for celebrating this debut with us. You said you love debuts. Charis loves debuts.
Is this in front of the camera?
Yes, it is. Folks can see it. They can order it right now. So for our virtual folks, click the teal button at the bottom of the screen to buy Neruda on the Park from Charis Books and More. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. We're going to say thank you and good night.